And although definitions of what it means to be politically correct are a little few and far between, and I suppose the actual harms of political correctness are a bit nebulous and hard to pin down, we've heard from many of our politicians and academics that political correctness is something that we need to be on guard against. Our current Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, just answered the question that this panel poses in a speech just the other day, calling campuses, quote, echo chambers of political correctness and shelters for fragile egos. Our president himself has urged us all and has shown us by his example not to be politically correct, arguing that it is hampering national security. And I should say that political correctness is not just a bugaboo of those who are more politically on the right. Those who are left-leaning as well have worried about the impact of political correctness and its potentially chilling effects on free speech. And especially in such institutions as here at Kenyon College, where we sort of pride ourselves on lively, no-hold-barred debate. Today we have two speakers on our panel who have very different views and approaches to this question and topic. We have Professor Derald Wing-Soo. He's a professor of psychology and education at Teachers College at Columbia University. And his work has focused, or his more recent work I should say, has focused on racism, on how racism has, as he says, morphed and gone underground, manifesting itself in what he terms microaggressions. These unintentional and often unconsciously inflicted slights to members of minority groups that can take a devastating toll on the self-confidence and sense of self-worth of those who they are directed against. He is the author of many acclaimed books, including Microaggressions in Everyday Life, and more recently, Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence. Professor Laura Kipnis is a professor of radio, television, and film at Northwestern University's School of Communication. She has found herself, perhaps unwittingly, thrown into this debate on political correctness in the academy when she agreed to act as a faculty support person for a fellow professor facing a Title IX complaint. She has gone on to write several articles about her misgivings with how Title IX complaints are handled by universities, recently publishing a book titled Unwanted Advances, Sexual Paranoia Comes to Campus. I'm going to give each of our speakers a few minutes to talk. I've got a few questions for them, and then we will open it up to all of you for hopefully what will be a lively debate.
Thanks. I was told 8 minutes to condense what I have to say into 8 minutes, so I'll do my best. I was going to start with a brief rant about the phrase political correctness because it just grates on me when I see that, and so I was sort of dismayed to be put on that panel. I mean, it does seem like a phrase that right-wing talk show hosts throw around to confuse style with substance and to dismiss the substance of, say, student activists, demands about social justice and complaints about such things as race and gender discrimination. I mean, the thing is that yes, what we want from our students, I think, is more nuance in these discussions, but the attack on, using this phrase political correctness just seems to me to lack all the nuance that these right-wing talk show hosts are attacking students for not having. So I won't rant further about the phrase, but I mean, the implication always seems to be that the left-leaning students are sheep and the right-wing or people are more independent-minded. So I just think that that is demonstrably not true. The thing is that I shouldn't be the one saying this, probably, because, as you heard, I mean, how I got propelled into the midst of these free speech debates was by writing an essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education. It was titled Sexual Paranoia Strikes Academe. And then having my own free speech privileges, I guess, attempt to be abridged, I was brought up on Title IX complaints for writing this essay by 2 graduate students. First, there was actually a student protest march against the essay, which actually I found sort of flattering, and when when I ultimately wrote about it, I said, all my writer friends turned out to be jealous that I was getting marched on and they weren't. So I realized that actually I was in a sort of privileged position just by virtue of being protested, which does make you feel strangely, effectual in the world, which writers don't usually get to feel. But then I was brought up on these Title IX complaints, and this was a couple of years ago, before Title IX was so much in the news as it's been in the last month or so. I had no idea what it was. I mean, it had something to do with women's sports, I knew. I didn't know you could be brought up on Title IX complaints for writing an essay. And, you know, probably you can't, but one of the things that's happened is a sort of mission creep about what Title IX comprises. And that's what I want to talk about, is not Title IX itself and the legitimacy of it, but I want to talk about the overlaps between Title IX and free speech issues, you know, which starts with the fact that some students on my campus felt you could bring a professor, a feminist professor, up on Title IX complaints over an essay. And, you know, I ended up going public once again because there was a second round of Title IX complaints against me over the book that came out in April, Unwanted Advances, by a group of 4 faculty members and 6 graduate students on my campus. So having been, you know, I'm going to skip around a little bit, but having been found innocent once on Title IX complaints didn't mean that people didn't feel that they could deploy Title IX once again to, I would say, retaliate against someone whose views they did not agree with. So in the first instance, I went through something like a 72-day investigation, and then I ended up writing a second essay called My Title IX Inquisition about having been brought up on these complaints. And what happened was, because very few people have been able to go public about Title IX complaints, I started hearing from people all over the country who had been brought up on Title IX complaints for very specious reasons, both students and professors, but oftentimes professors over a joke, professors, graduate students, a joke made in an off-campus bar, something said in class, in some cases students bringing professors up on Title IX complaints over feeling that the professor's syllabus was slanted in some direction or another, because the ways that campuses have implemented the Title IX directives in the earlier version of the Dear Colleague letters, before, you know, as you've probably read it, these were rescinded effectively in the last couple of weeks by Betsy DeVos and the new regime in the Department of Education. The language is so vague, such a thing as creating a hostile environment. So in my case, having written this first essay in the Chronicle, Sexual Paranoia Strikes Academe, I was accused of creating a hostile environment on campus, or maybe it was a chilling effect. You know, I was never quite sure which, because one of the things I found out is that you don't get the charges in writing. So there were all sorts of issues involving due process that I learned about and became sort of an expert about, especially as once I went public about the case, people started telling me about the sorts of procedures that they had gone through. So what I want to talk about is what's not known about Title IX, leaving aside the part about its mission to lessen instances of sexual assault and harassment on campus, but the confidentiality strictures that are built into it. Because people who are brought up on these sorts of complaints are threatened that if they speak about these complaints, they can be subject to more complaints on the basis of retaliation. And so part of the charges against me were for retaliation because I had written about the case of a professor on our campus who had been accused of sexual misconduct. And in the first instance, I didn't know much about this professor or the situation. I wrote a couple of paragraphs, and that was the basis for the Title IX complaints. But then I did end up being asked to be his faculty support person at a dismissal hearing, and got my hands on a bunch of confidential documents and the Title IX reports themselves about how the accusations against him had been adjudicated. And I found they were incredibly unprocedural, incredibly shot through with gender bias, very capricious, really like guesswork on the part of, you know, this is my opinion, the Title IX officers who were involved in this. But by this, because I wrote my analysis of the case in the book in Unwanted Advances, I was brought up on Title IX complaints again. So the idea that you, by being a critic of Title IX and writing about the details of the process, you can be yourself subject to Title IX complaints is something that people don't know about. And one of the reasons I was in a position to go public about this and to criticize the process is because I have tenure at a research university. And so I very much disagree with what Stanley said this morning, that academic freedom is something that, always, something that really doesn't matter, because my defense against the charges against me was a defense based on academic freedom, that this was a research subject for me, that I, am somebody who has throughout my career written about sexual politics. And that was even part of the finding in the first, actually in both cases, that because this had been a research subject of mine, I was allowed to write about this. But it's now a fact that something like half of the professoriate does not have tenure, or is not on a tenure stream. And the fact is that these people, if people in those positions get brought up on a Title IX complaint, even if they're found innocent, those people are likely out of a job because they have no job security. And I know of tons of instances where this has happened. Someone gets brought up on a charge, whether it's a dispute in a classroom, and this just happened at the school, the Art Institute in Chicago, where an art history professor, for talking about theories about an outsider artist named Henry Darger, his students, and particularly trans students in the class, thought that he was being anti-trans by talking about theories about the origins of Darger's work. His imagery sometimes involves little girls with penises. And one of the theories about Darger is that he himself was sexually abused as a child. He grew up in institutions. So some of the students in class, and particularly trans students, objected that this was transphobic, and that the professor, Michael Bonesteel, should have consulted with students in the class to hear what their positions were, and that sort of thing. And so Bonesteel, the professor, did not have tenure protection. He was an instructor. He taught on an ad hoc basis. And his teaching, he was sort of found innocent. He was supposed to go to sensitivity training or something like that and have his syllabi approved. But they cut his teaching down to the point that he lost his health insurance, and so he ended up quitting. And because I'm now a kind of go-to person on other people's Title IX complaints, I end up hearing about a lot of situations like this that are not public. There's no aggregated information about the Title IX complaints and how Title IX is being deployed around the country. And it's because of the confidentiality strictures. It's because people fear that even if they're let off on the charges, if they speak about them, they'll face retaliation charges. So, I am not somebody who in any way wants to be associated with the Trump administration. But when DeVos rescinded the Dear Colleague letter last week or a couple weeks ago and used the term gag orders, that we cannot subject people who go through these procedures to gag orders and prevent them from speaking about their cases, this was, I thought, an incredibly important step to ensure something like a fair process, or at least a process that has some transparency to it. So what I have found, and from talking to people who've been through this, is that because of the lack of transparency, there's been a very over-empowered administrative class on campuses who are deploying these codes in incredibly capricious manners and in the manner that they see fit. So every Title IX officer around the country is more or less inventing and rewriting how Title IX should be adjudicated in individual cases with no oversight. So until these cases go to civil court, which is happening increasingly, particularly with undergrad male students suing their universities, and a few cases by professors are starting to go forward, we don't actually know what's happening in these adjudications, which have often been referred to as kangaroo courts or star chambers. It's just happening behind closed doors. And I have given talks about this to audiences of progressive, even queer professors, and talked about how many queer professors are being targeted in these procedures, and had people in the audience say to me, this is not true. I don't recognize the campus that you're describing because none of this is public. So I'm all for the ending of the gag orders, and I actually think that these processes, I understand the reasons for the confidentiality requirements because I understand part of the goal is to get more students, particularly women students, to come forward with stories and complaints about sexual misconduct, harassment, and assault, and that the fear is if these are open sorts of procedures, there'll be fewer complaints. I understand that, but from my knowledge of the situation, which is anecdotal and sporadic because, as I say, there's no collected source of information, these procedures are being there's so much overstepping and mission creep effectively in Title IX offices that we need to know what's going on. Let me just see if there's anything else that I meant to say about this. I'll just say one more thing. What I was talking about in the first essay that I wrote was the sexual paranoia essay, was that I did not think that the new regulations on campus were doing anything to either empower women students or address the realities of sexual assault and misconduct on campus. Partly because there are a lot of unsaids, things that people very much fear talking about because if you do, you'll be subject to a lot of controversy. I mean, and to some degree I have. You know, people are fearful of speaking out because of what will happen on Twitter. You know, that you'll be called an anti-feminist if, for example, you talk about the issue of drinking in relation to sexual assault, which I wrote a chapter about in Unwanted Advances. So my point was that the unsaids and the not speaking about these subjects were in no way, I mean, we're actually impeding progress in addressing sexual misconduct and assault on campuses. And I still think that the more I learn, and that what's happened is that this we've heard a lot about the growth of the administration and partly beefed up because of Title IX codes. These are people who are favoring regulation over education and favoring turning campuses into something like carceral states where criminalization is the answer to the sexual misconduct problem as opposed to education. So that is the value that I think could come of having more honest conversations about difficult subjects, including drunken sex, including the degree to which women students, 50 years after the advent of second wave feminism, still are feel not able to say no in sexual situations. You know, the realities of what's going on between men and women students at frat parties, in drunken situations, and having, once again, more honest discussions about those realities and favoring education over regulation and favoring education over criminalization of such things as drunken sex. Now that codes are being enacted where drunken sex itself is considered a form of assault, and it's obviously always the male student who's going to be held responsible. Ordinary sex, vast segments of the student population are being criminalized. And the faculty are not taking part in these discussions because all of this stuff has been handed over to administrators whose goal really is to increase the purview of their offices by finding more things to prosecute and more things to administrate. And so, I think mission creep is the, a word for it, but so is like an increasing criminalization of the campus context in favor of and in lieu of education, which is what we should be doing.
Thank you. Professor Sue?
You know, several quick comments before we get into it. One of them is that I caught the latter part of the panel from before, and it was quite intense. And I'm reminded of my father's Asian saying that not all problems have solutions. You just have to grow around it. The other thing I do want to say is that, Abbie, you introduced Laura and I as having different perspectives or viewpoints. I'm not sure that we do. I don't know that much about the situation that you went through, so I'm not really certain that that's so. The third thing that's important is that when we did the original work on microaggressions and said that modern forms of bias and discrimination had morphed into implicit, unconscious forms of expression, and we dealt most of our research in terms of the unintentional forms, well, things are changing. You know, in terms of the microaggression taxonomy that we developed, there are micro-assaults, micro-insults, and micro-invalidations. What are microaggressions? Well, microaggressions are the everyday put-downs, insults, and validations that people of color, I'm going to talk mainly about racial microaggressions, but in essence, almost any marginalized group in our society can experience microaggressions. There are gender microaggressions. There are LGBTQ microaggressions, disability microaggressions. The themes on microaggressions differ, but the principles that underlie them remain the same. I like to introduce the topic of microaggressions because there is much currently going on. Many of you know that for the first time last year, the term microaggression has been included in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and it's now recognized. And many people say it's like a prairie fire that has gone through higher education and has now creeped into the workforce. There are a lot of misunderstandings and myths about microaggressions, and I would like to try to clarify. There is the harmless impact controversy, the victimhood controversy, the free speech controversy that has all arisen as a result of our looking. There are, you know, I like sayings, and this is something that I would like to share with you. There's an African proverb that goes something like this: the true tale of the lion hunt will never be told as long as the hunter tells the story. And you have to see microaggressions as two different types of narratives going on. There is a master narrative of our society. Almost all dialogues that I watch on television and see between students in my classes represent clashes of racial realities. Now, I don't want to stereotype, but the racial reality of many white Americans are different from the racial realities of people of color. The master narrative that is played out in racial dialogues in our society tend to have common themes. Racism is a thing of the past. America is a land of opportunity. Anyone can succeed in our society if they work hard enough. The counter narrative that I call backtalk is that people of color have a different narrative. Racism is not a thing of the past. It is present, thriving, and alive in its present form. Equal access and opportunity doesn't exist. America is a land of opportunity for certain groups, but not for everyone. Meritocracy is a myth. Now, these are played out in dialogues that are going on, and it frames the issue of microaggressions, because when marginalized group members talk about microaggressions, it is difficult for those with power and privilege to really understand this. And Maya Angelou, her two passages Still I Rise really gets to the heart of microaggressions. She didn't use the term microaggressions, but this was what she talked about. Two of her passages, you may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may tread me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air I'll rise. Now, many people who read these passages that are well known, people of color, these are the voices that come that she speaks on behalf of many of us. Many people that think that she's talking about the overt racists, the hate crimes, the skinheads, the clans, and indeed she does refer to them. But she, in these passages, are talking about the ordinary, invisible forms of bias that occur to people. And the biases that come out are outside the conscious awareness of well-intentioned individuals who are unaware. Microaggressions are reflections of implicit bias, a worldview of superiority, inferiority, normality, and abnormality. And in these passages, even though she doesn't use the term microaggressions, she's saying that these slights are verbal, nonverbal, and environmental. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. She is saying environmentally, there are microaggressions in the curriculum, in the air we breathe, on the campus climate or work climate that is present here. And she says that you may shoot me with your words. Now, there are a lot, and I'm not talking about hate speech, that you're a Jap, you're a chink. I'm talking about the everyday slights that people say they appear normal. I am frequently complimented for speaking good English. My response all the time is thank you, I hope so, I was born here. Now, many of you will say that, how does that represent a microaggression? Well, the perpetrator is a good person. They consciously are complimenting me. The meta-communication that is coming to me is that you are a perpetual alien in your own country. You are not a true American. When employers interview candidates of color, and they make a statement such as, I believe the most qualified person should get the job. Well, yes, all of us agree with that. But oftentimes the bias is disguised by saying, as a black person, Latino person, you aren't qualified. I am making it the judgment that has nothing to do with bias and discrimination. This is also nonverbal communications, and I'll share this with you shortly, but oftentimes, people, walk past an African-American individual, they clutch their purses more tightly. And this is a thing that Maya Angelou says, that she fears microaggressions, the everyday slights, more than the overt hate crimes that occur. She is saying it is similar to death by 1,000 cuts. It is continual and present. Now, this is another thing that I want to share with you. I'm going to stand because I don't have this portion memorized. This comes from an African-American student. This is the lived reality that many well-intentioned brothers and sisters oftentimes don't see in terms of what people of color go through. This is an African-American. An African-American student, was riding the #1 train, subway, to the first day of classes at Columbia University. As usual, the seat next to me is empty, even though the train was packed with people sitting and standing. People are scared to sit next to a black person because you are a plague. The good thing is that you always get more room. But I felt angry and agitated and thought it never seems to end. Go to classes and sit next to a white student and she pulls her purse closer to her. Yes, because you are a criminal. Stand in the cafeteria and others will tell you to clear their table. You don't know how many times I get asked, how did you get into Columbia? When I tell them good grades and SAT scores, they don't believe you. I felt like hitting a white student when he asked, quote, no, I mean, how did you really get in? You try to hold it in, but sometimes you lose it. Explaining doesn't help. They really don't want to hear. When they ask, why do you always have a chip on your shoulder? Shit, I just walk away now. We have, in our studies with microaggressions, we have collected literally hundreds of narratives that talk about these areas. And the questions that I think are very important for us to consider and look at are these, because this is where the clash of worldviews and racial realities occur. When I tell people that these microaggressions are harmful, hey, look we don't want you to coddle these students. They need to stand up on their own rights. They're harmless, insignificant, and trivial. They dismiss the impact of it. So some of the questions that I frequently ask individuals when I do this type of training is life as hard as this black student describes? Believe it or not, many people who have power and privilege cannot see that racial reality. Is he exaggerating or misreading the actions of others? And oftentimes, like I was saying, people of color who raise issues of bias, prejudice, discrimination, unfair treatment are labeled being oversensitive, paranoid. In fact, you even pathologize a response. When African Americans raise an issue, they are labeled the angry black man or woman. And it is very damaging and silencing in that respect. Is he right in concluding that others don't want to listen to his explanations? My work in racial dialogues, where we have literally gone through group after group in terms of looking at this, indicate that many, not all, but many white brothers and sisters don't want to hear the answer. Why do you have a chip on your shoulder? When you try to tell it, they get very anxious and defensive, because for them to entertain the possibility that what this person is saying is true means in some sense that they have walked around in a world of invisibility in which they don't realize they are equally responsible for the harm. Why is he so angry and resentful? Well, this is something very important, where the reactions of people of color are oftentimes pathologized. And as a psychologist, I was exposed to the writings of R.D. Lang, an existential psychiatrist, who once asked this question that is applicable here. Is schizophrenia a reaction to a healthy society, or is it a healthy reaction to a sick society? And I'm asking all of you to consider the fact that people of color's reactions are based upon a society that's structured in such a way that some groups are advantaged over others. And the other thing here is, do you believe him or not? If not, what are your reasons? And so this is something that I want us to look at. And, you know, I don't think that we're that that political correctness is something that is affecting the academy here. I think political correctness, issues of free speech, are the tip of the iceberg of other things going on that deal with microaggressions, that deal with what is going on in our society and culture right now. And that is a thing that I think we have taken our eyes off the ball. You know, PEN America, an organization of over 4,000 novelists, journalists, writers that include people like Salman Rushdie, Thomas Mann, James Baldwin, are a group that believe in free speech. But in their study of 4 major campuses, UCLA, Harvard, and I think 2 other campuses, they concluded that the issue of free speech and political correctness was a red herring, that it is oftentimes used as a cudgel to silence the voices of dissent that is going on, that expressions of microaggressions is actually not something that prevents free speech, but is an expression of free speech. And this is what I think is very important for us to look at, which is what is going on underneath. I mean, it's important for us to debate and dialogue the issues of free speech. But like I was saying, I've become increasingly aware of how free speech, political correctness, playing the race card, playing the gender card, are attempts to games or tactics of verbal jujitsu, where you turn the tables on the person raising legitimate issues. And that's what I'm concerned about, that's where we're going at the present time, and it means that we aren't really addressing the real, intimate, problematic issues that is confronting our society now. Did I go too long?
Oh, that was great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can I speak to this?
Yes, definitely. Jump in.
So I think we agree that the term political correctness is a red herring and that that's not what we're here to talk about. But where I think that we disagree, or maybe what you've said clarifies for me some things that I was talking about, is I think where we disagree is maybe about the privileging of subjectivity in these debates and on campus. So, you know, when I was accused in the first round of Title IX complaints of having created a hostile environment on campus, I said to them, you know, it's a big campus. How do you know that I've created a hostile environment? And they said, your accusers have given us a list of 12 people to interview who will say that they have been, you know, feel intimidated by what you said. And that was supposed to be grounds to charge me, you know, under Title IX, that I'd created this hostile environment based on 12 people's subjective account of feeling intimidated or chilled by what I had said. So I think that there's some overlap in what we're talking about in that what I've found out about in Title IX complaints, and so I'm kind of shifting the conversation a bit back to gender, which is what I know more about rather than the racial kinds of issues of microaggression, is that there's sort of an increased sense of sensitivity and affront, I think, in the student population at the moment, to the extent that, as I see, there are a lot of cases where, like, say, a professor will be accused of something like making the wrong eye contact at a student, or posting a Facebook post that may have some sexual innuendo. And I have looked at this Facebook post and can't see any sexual innuendo in it. But, like, let's take this issue of making the wrong eye contact, because I've heard this more than once. It gets, this is a charge that gets pressed particularly against male professors. So that's like somebody's subjective sense that somebody else has looked at them in a weird way, partly because there really is a very heightened tenor of sexual suspicion at the moment, partly brought about by more discussions about sexual vulnerability on campus, and this sort of insistence, I think particularly, that women students are perpetually at risk and perpetually victimized. And one of the things I was going to say about speech is that in the conversations about this on campus, you have this incredible amount of deployment of statistics in lieu of conversation. So, if you say, well how much, I've been reading Steven Pinker's book about, there's a phrase he uses, there's something which I wrote in about, there's almost a desire to see oneself as a victim. And so the question is, how do we process or adjudicate the sorts of complaints that you're talking about when there may be a heightened sensitivity to this sense of affront or to somebody as being in a position of, being affronted? I mean, I ride the one train all the time. And, it doesn't seem to me like oftentimes, there's certainly no empty seats a lot of the time. So, I mean, it may be that a student feels that somebody, a white person won't sit next to a person of color on the one train. And, perhaps my vision is narrowed by being a white person, but, it's not something I see. So I understand that people feel vulnerabilized in a lot of different situations now. But how do we on campus adjudicate these things when they're really resting on people's subjective accounts of their feelings about the situation?
Yeah. I think that's a good question. It gets to the heart of something I think, Abbie, that I wrote to you about, and that is that whose reality is accurate? And I guess there are ways to measure emotions and subjective experiences. There are findings about nonverbal communication and what it means. In fact, I think that a number of studies indicate that people of color and women are better readers of nonverbal communication than their white male counterparts. And that goes to the, and in fact, there's a common saying among African Americans that if you really want to know where Dr. Jones is coming from, don't listen to what they say, but how they say it. And the truth is that nonverbal communications are more accurate reflections in terms of the studies of where you're coming from, your values, as opposed to the words that you can control. But getting back to this issue of, I think first and foremost, dialogue is important. I mean, I think that you and I can sit down and dialogue and have differences. What I don't like is monologues. If you watch these dialogues on race, gender, sexual orientation, they are monologues where one person states their position firmly, the other counters, and then they restate the position. Even there is not a dialogue going on. And I think that that's the first thing that we need to do. The second important element is that I would say that findings suggest that the groups, again, I go to social psychological studies, the groups that are most disempowered on issues of bias and discrimination have the most accurate view of what has happened. Now, that's a general thing that's going on, and it makes sense to me in the sense that for a woman to do well in corporate world, they have to understand the thinking of white men and the white institution than a white man to do well, to get promoted, doesn't have to understand their female counterparts very well. This is something that people of color have oftentimes experienced, that we understand white people better than they understand us. And I think that's a given. The other thing I think that comes across very clearly is the statement that if you really want to understand sexism, do you ask men or women? And if you look at congressional hearings on women's rights, you have this panel of all men, not even women, called to testify. And I guess I'm just saying that it's clear to me as a rule, issues of bias and discrimination, it can be wrong, tend to be most accurate for the groups that are most oppressed and silenced. I don't know about your situation, Laura, and I could talk to you about it. From the way you present it, I feel it's open for a dialogue, and that's what should be taken. And I would stand with you and say, hey, look, you wrote that. I didn't read it in the Chronicle of Higher Education. I would say I disagree with it. I feel uncomfortable with it. But that is challenging me so that I can change. That's different from a Milo, what's his last name, Yiannopoulos, who really is abusive. He's not dialoguing. And we can grow from what you wrote, and unfortunately, you're caught. The other thing, let me quickly mention, why are people becoming more sensitive now? I'm not sure. I think that what is happening is that people of color, marginalized group members, are reaching a critical mass. They are now feeling empowered. They used to, just put up with things in silence. But now, as they've grown, as the language has, they are much more, courageous in terms of putting out things that are going on. And I think I was telling over lunchtime with Sean, the president of Kenyon here, that things are going to get worse before they get better. And the reason why I say that is that there are demographic changes here that are shaking the very foundations of our society. There's what I call the feminization of the workplace, the graying of America. The most problematic thing for our society is a changing complexion of society. The statistics indicate that from the years 2030 to 2050, people of color will become a numerical majority. And people in our society many people don't like the changes that are occurring. We're getting a revolution now where I'm hearing people frightened and pushing back, and that's why overt forms of racism is coming out so strongly. That people are now saying things that they would never have said before, and that these things, I think they want us to go back. They're scared to death that their way of life is disappearing. They're scared that they want to go back, and I'm going to say it very harshly, to when marriage was between a man and a woman, when homosexuality was a pathology, when women knew their place and were not uppity, that people of color knew their place at this time. And, this gets political, but this is not me saying it. When President Trump says, "Make America great again," many people of color here make America white again. Now, that isn't necessarily in the consciousness of people, and this is where I think the microaggressions come out. All the negative messages that are coming out, the pot has stirred and it's just bubbled to the surface, and it's scary.
So I'm going to say something unfeminine, that I don't think it's necessarily in our interests, women or perhaps people of color, to be as exquisitely attuned to these social cues as we are. So I was somebody, back when Anita Hill was protesting about the Clarence Thomas joke about the pubic hair on the Coke can, and I was like, who cares? If there was the ability to just step back and think, what a stupid joke, rather than get to succumb so much to whatever his purposes were, it seems to me she would have been in a better position.
See, Laura,
could I finish? Yeah. There's something else that I want to go on to say. This is going to sound old-fashioned and make me sound like some sort of neocon, which I am not. I'm a left-wing feminist. But I actually think the focus on subjectivity on campus is depriving students of what is a skill that would suit them better, which is analytic distance. like the ability to step back from an experience or from a joke or from whatever and analyze it, use analytical tools as opposed to succumb to the emotions or the affront or perhaps even the projection of what's going on in that situation. So to go back to my example of the student pressing the charges against the professor who's made, which he thinks is the wrong eye contact, you know, the heightened level of sensitivity to sexual injury and sexual affront at this moment is sort of out of scale. So it is an interesting question. Why does sex seem so much more disgusting than it did for previous generations, to the point that we need these adjudications and these procedures to deal with something like eye contact? So my overall point is that, at least speaking from the standpoint of a woman, a feminist, a teacher, I don't think it's in our students' best interest to be as attuned to every nuance of eye contact or joke or, you know, affront as I think we're actually training our students to be.
You know, I guess I do see it differently. You know, one of the things that I think people, when we first came out with the taxonomy of microaggressions and the research on it in 2007, colleagues of mine were very caustic. They wrote, you know, letters into the American psychologists saying that microaggressions are macro nonsense, that we were building a mountain out of a molehill, that we were painting people of color as weak and vulnerable, because these are slights that anyone can experience. And what we looked at was that they don't realize that the everyday incivilities and rudeness that any of us encounter, regardless of race or gender, is much different from a racial, gender, sexual orientation microaggression. And it's different in the following way. In fact, they have done studies that indicate that if a non-race-based rudeness or incivility had the uncomfortable impact, but not when it was group-based. And they found that these were the differences. Microaggressions are constant and continual for especially people of color. And everyday rudeness occurs and it ends, but people of color experience microaggressions from the time they awaken until they go to bed, from the time they are born until they are, die. Microaggressions are also cumulative, and any one alone may appear insignificant, but cumulatively, one represents the feather that breaks the camel's back. So it's not, as this narrative says, it's not that, why should I get upset when someone compliments me? I don't now, because I've got a comeback, compliments me for speaking good English. But when I experience the same question over and over, when my teacher doesn't teach me about the history of Chinese Americans and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, when the only time she talks with me about being Chinese was when we studied a unit of China. And she would turn to me and say, "Derald, what is it that you people do in China?" And I'd say, "I don't know." I mean, because the hidden messages, you're not an American. And I'm saying that maybe the pubic hair, but it's offensive because it is long-term cumulative in nature. And microaggressions are constant reminders of a person's second-class status in this society. I know how I'm viewed in this society, not equal to a lot of the people that are around. Microaggressions are symbolic of past historical injustices. The enslavement of African Americans, the taking away of land of the indigenous people of this country, the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. And my Muslim brothers and sisters are worried about that because it has happened when they were placed in concentration camps, and 2/3 of the 110 were Americans by virtue of birth. And so I guess what I'm saying is that it would be nice if they didn't take offense and was able to talk about it, but the human situation is I can't take it anymore, and I just blow up and get upset. And that's where I think we have to look at the context of what we talk about and not take things individually out of context.
You know, I believe there have to be inclusive campuses, and I don't think you can have a situation like at Cornell where you've got students standing outside the Latino Center yelling, "Build the wall." So, I mean, I am in favor of campuses having some sort of community standards about not excluding or, you know, speech acts that exclude certain populations. At the same time, I know that as a teacher, and I hear this from teachers all over the country, you're in a sort of impossible position, because I think kind of what you're saying is if a teacher doesn't acknowledge a student's race or ethnicity, that in itself could be a sort of microaggression. Yet if you do, you actually certainly do not want to call on a student as a member of X or Y group and say, can you speak as that group? So, I mean, there's a way in which the classroom has become a kind of minefield around these issues. And I think most professors that I know are just terrified of getting caught in the middle of one of these situations. And I mean, so being accused on one side or the other. And it would be nice if these could be these could spur conversations between us all that would be informative and educational. But what happens now is because the administrative staff is so bloated, these complaints go right to an assistant dean's office or a student dean, and they become a formal complaint, and people actually are losing their jobs or getting kicked out of school. So it immediately becomes a procedure as opposed to a conversation.
Yeah. And I think you've hit it right on the target, that it's not that teachers don't want to facilitate these difficult dialogues on race, gender, and sexual orientation. It's that they don't know how to. And you're touching hot emotional buttons in people.
And they're different for every student.
Yes.
I mean, that's the thing. One student will want to talk about it one way or another way, and equally you can be subject to complaints. So yes, faculty often, I think, steer clear of this. Exactly.
In my book, Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence, I have 2 chapters I want you to be aware of that talk about what educators can do in the classroom to encourage these difficult dialogues that are going on and preventing them from becoming the classroom from hell.
Well, that's a nice segue, actually, to opening this up to students who have questions. I strongly encourage you to ask, or anyone else in the audience who would like to engage with our speakers today. Let me get back there. I think I see a student hand. I did. Jules, go ahead.
So I've been listening. Is this on? Okay.
Professor Sue,
JK.
sorry. Professor Sue, your scenario about the Black Columbia student and his emotional turmoil toward the microaggressions he faced every day kind of reminded me of a lot of the different themes that we have been talking about today. It's been argued throughout the conference that speech is not protected if the speech carries with it an imminent threat to a person. And I think in the previous panel we discussed that emotional wounds are just as important in the long term as physical wounds in the present, which kind of goes against the imminent of it, but I think it's still important. So another thing that I wanted to kind of bring up is that there has been a difference struck between free speech in the classroom as well as outside of the classroom. Professor Fish talked about this a little bit in the first session this morning. And I think that that line is kind of blurred on a residential campus like Kenyon, in that we have classroom experiences, but we also do a lot of learning outside of the classroom, hence we are all here learning about free speech. I think a lot of students on campus also have leadership positions that put them in awkward positions, and that sometimes they have to make judgment calls in order to help to build community on campus. I work as someone who is in the residence halls. I have a community that I have to build. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas, and Professor Kipnis, you can also chime in, if you have any ideas on how student leaders can make people in the community feel safe while also not stifling the opinions of people who might criticize those students, people of color, people that are sexual assault survivors, of being too politically correct.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I would say is that the student leaders need to have two attributes. One of them is to understand themselves as racial, cultural, gendered beings. They have to be very secure in understanding that, because when you go out and interact with people, they're going to push a lot of buttons on you. And when those buttons come out emotionally, they can interfere with your ability to communicate with other individuals. The second thing I think is important is that the type of work you do is exhausting. You know, I don't know if people realize how exhausting it is to, for example, faculty of color to teach a course on racism. For individuals who are dealing with this all the time, you sometimes feel like you want to take a hammer and hit someone rather than you've got to work that through. And one way to do it is that you need to seek a support group. Other individuals who can validate what is going on with you, what is happening, and provide suggestions about what you can do in terms of working with other individuals. And I would say that one of the effective things that oftentimes happen is to ask someone to come in that can help you train the trainers. All of you are out there. There are a lot of various techniques and strategies that can be used to get people to begin to see what and who they are in terms of the operation here. Did you?
I guess one thing I would say is that one of the things that's happened in relation to discussions of identity on campus recently, I mean, over maybe the last 10 or so years, maybe a bit longer, particularly as identity politics sort of became more of the intellectual current, and people are quite often doing work on subjects, faculty and students as well, doing work on subjects that stem from their own identities, is that I think the notion of identity has become very singular. And I mean, when I was sort of coming of age intellectually, there were, I think, more complicated notions of identity as sort of more multiple, as, conflicting even. And I mean, something of a weirdo, like a feminist Freudian, and interested in the ways in a Freudian model, we're split in terms of our identities and our identifications. And I think that that ability to kind of have a sense of moving through different identities can be one that frees you from being pinned down to one. And I certainly understand that there are material realities, material effects that people of color and other minorities are dealing with all the time in terms of the way their identities are being pinned down by other people. But at the same time, the idea of being able to weave through and be strategic about the ways you do or don't adopt those positions other people are slotting you into, I think can be a kind of, to use an old-fashioned phrase, liberation. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, like something like Fanon, who was something I read a lot as I was coming up, who combined a kind of anti-colonialism with psychoanalytic theory, and had an idea of identity as more nimble and mobile, I think, than the ones that are prevalent in our theoretical apparatus at the moment. I think is like a fruitful sort of thinker. So I do wish intellectually on campus we faculty were teaching our students like the range of theories about identity that are available, as opposed to the ones that restrict us to the more singular identities.
last time. Okay. I was wondering, is it Lauren? Laura? Dr. something? Laura. Okay. I was wondering, so on one hand, you're talking about how notions of identity were previously multiple, but then from what I'm hearing about you talking about Title IX, it seems very heteronormative and specific to kind of two genders in terms of the fundamental paradigm. You also talked about it may not suit students to be as aware of those things. And to that, I'm like, to suit them for what? To be prepared for the world as it does exist? Because it seems as though students today are saying, we don't want that. So to be, in terms of being on a college campus and saying, we don't want these types of behaviors and we would like administrators and teachers to collaborate in order to give us the tools to create the world that we want to see, and then seeing sort of in the way that you're talking about Title IX, it's not accounting, it's accounting for gender and race as separate categories. Like, have you engaged with sort of intersectionality as a fundamental paradigm for how Title IX could exist? And so I don't know, and I'm really not trying to like come at you in any way, but just it seems as though even in relation to this person's comments about race, you had framed it in terms of, oh, well, I don't know about race. But fundamentally, gender and race being seen as different categories entirely kind of inherently excludes a whole bunch of people's experiences. So how might you engage with that as you're sort of advocating for free speech, advocating for academic freedom, and understanding that perhaps gender and race can exist in the same space, in the same time, and be implemented together and in mindfulness of each other?
Yeah. So there was just a really great 3-part series in The Atlantic by Emily Yaffe about Title IX. And the last part, she's done some great reporting on it. And it's a very difficult subject to report on because, like I say, so much is confidential. The last part was about race and Title IX. And her point is that she makes a claim, and other people who have studied it are making this claim also, that more students of color, male students of color, are brought up on Title IX complaints than white students are brought up on Title IX complaints, that it impacts most severely on male students of color. Most of the situations that we hear about are heterosexual, but like I say, there's not really aggregated data. But one of the most interesting cases that's out there, and this I think answers a bunch of your questions, is a case at Brandeis a few years ago between 2 male students. And we know about this because it became a civil suit. Otherwise, it would have been behind closed doors. So Brandeis had a special examiner, I think was the title for the person who did the adjudication. So these were 2 male students. They'd been in a relationship. There was a breakup. One accused the other of having kissed him while he was asleep, and thus having sexually assaulted him because he couldn't consent to being kissed while he was asleep. And Brandeis' special examiner found that that was true, that the student who kissed the sleeping student had assaulted him because the sleeping student couldn't consent. The student was kicked out of school. He pressed a civil suit, and by the way, to press a civil suit, you have to be pretty much rich because it costs upward of $100,000 and up to $1 million if it goes to trial. So this student, I guess, had access to money, had wealthy parents. The student went to a judge. The judge said, more or less, are you kidding? This is what campuses are calling sexual assault now. So part of the argument that I'm making in this book and what I've learned about is that the parameters of what constitutes sexual assault is being stretched and stretched and stretched so that kissing someone while he's asleep could be construed as sexual assault. So I understand what you're saying, that students on campus want to deal with sexual assault. Partly what my research shows me is that we don't know what's meant by the term sexual assault. So that's something to be aware of. And according to a lot of the reporting, it is students of color who are most vulnerable. So I would suggest you read this piece in The Atlantic last month that's online by Emily Yaffe about that.
That doesn't address the fundamental paradigm of Title IX. It's like framed in terms of a specific group.
In terms of a specific group?
In terms of a specific group.
No, it's not. But I mean, how so? I mean, I think covertly it addresses women as the vulnerable victims, but in practice, anybody can bring a Title IX case. My accusers were women. The accuser in the Brandeis case was a male student accusing a male student. So it's written in gender neutral language.
Yeah, I was going to kind of add on to something you touched on. Just this idea of analytical distancing being something that like you develop from a lack of subjectivity. And if that's true, like, is that really the way that we want students to develop these skills? Would it not be more beneficial for them to kind of take a break and kind of incubate and learn new ideas when they don't feel that they're being attacked? Because personally, I've heard a lot of people express the fact that they then feel that their voices as a minority are even more taken down another peg until, if that was to happen in university, would they graduate with the same kind of sense of identity and understanding as they would if there was no political correctness? Does that kind of make sense? Like, just do those attacks, actually, should we be learning how to divert those attacks and push through them, or should we be learning how to develop our own characters and our identity so that we can then divert those attacks later on?
All of that. I mean, I think you're right. If I framed it too much as an either or, that was like a framing problem. Because no, I don't think in any way it should be an either or between, like subjectivity and intellect or analytical skills. And I mean, as a writer, I'm kind of trying to draw on all of that to the extent that I can. But part of the issue with going to adjudication on campus, whether it's through Title IX or filing complaints in other venues, as I think was said earlier today, it doesn't help prepare students for once you're out of school and there's no, well, maybe there's an HR person, but, there's not oftentimes somebody standing by who's going to adjudicate the situation, and you do have to have some kind of resources. And I think one of those resources is an ability to distance yourself from affront. Because there's all sorts of affronts all the time. And, here's another thing. I mean, sex can be gross. I will just tell you that. And I think that the mantra on campus, I mean, all my students are always talking about how pro-sex they are, and you have pro-sex student week and that kind of thing, which I think that in itself is a bit, underestimates how, just gross and unpleasant sex can be. And I think that, we're not educating our students sufficiently in the realities of that, that fact. And, particularly, to go back to what I said about drinking when drinking is involved. So, I mean, these are the sort of nitty-gritty realities of adult life. And I don't think, we should be cocooning anyone from that.
Kind of answers my question.
Now, Derald, you have to be aware that the very term microaggression has turned universities into a laughingstock. Probably, together with safe space and trigger warning, this is almost the code word now for what's gone wrong with universities. And it is not just among the right, although certainly among the right, but even among the center and the left, this is often identified as what's gone wrong with American campuses. And for a good reason. I mean, if you say something like, if someone says, I believe the most qualified person should get the job, and you call that aggression, I mean, that's patently absurd. And in many cases, a lot of the statements that are identified as microaggressions are oafish, they're tactless, they're sometimes clueless, but they often have some kernel of truth that probably needs to be considered in debates over campus policies. For example, the policy of affirmative action means that you may take race and gender into account in decisions about admissions. That means that there are some people on campus who would not be there if they weren't a different race or gender. Now that's a fact, that's the stated policy. So if someone brings that up in the case of an individual student, I agree, it's tactless and it's rude, but it's not false. Likewise, I think it's obnoxious when the conversation in a seminar turns to race or to ethnicity, for a professor or other students to look at the African American, look at the Asian American, and say, well, what do you think about that? However, that is the rationale for affirmative action. The affirmative action may not be implemented simply to raise the number of minorities, but the ostensible purpose is to increase diversity of opinion and therefore to enhance the education of all students, including the white majority. So the very idea of affirmative action that's actually practiced is that an African American student has some insight about being an African American that enhances the educational experience. Now, whether or not that's true, that is the stated policy. And so a professor who's doing that is actually acting in accord with the stated policy of affirmative action. Now, none of this is to necessarily justify these statements, but simply to indicate that they often raise truths that perhaps we ought to discuss. I agree that often discussions about race can raise uncomfortable emotions, but that's precisely why we shouldn't stigmatize them as any form of aggression, simply because disagreement is going to make people uncomfortable. It's going to hurt feelings. And getting back to the topic, the title of this session, of political correctness, as upset as many of us can be that the term has been co-opted by the right to attack anything they don't like on campus, the concept of political correctness, the sarcastic expression, comes from the fact that what is political is essentially contested and disputed. The sarcastic expression political correctness is satirizing the attitude that what is political can be deemed correct or incorrect. The implicit accusation is that is what universities are doing. And in fact, if one takes opinions that actually ought to be expressed, if only to be argued against, and calls them aggressions, it seems to me that vindicates the accusation that universities are engaging in political correctness, namely legislating by authority, by brute force, that some opinions are acceptable, other opinions are, as the expression would have it, acts of aggression.
You know, I guess there's so much to respond to, Stephen, what you've just said. You know, the first thing I really want to say is that, again, it's important for people to dialogue on this. Even Sigmund Freud, when talking about phallic symbols, said that even a banana can be a banana. And I'm saying that, yes, there are times in which it's not a microaggression for someone to ask me where I was born, you know, and this is where there is misunderstanding. The second thing I think I would point out is that, you know, that we do have affirmative action. That even if when we talk about affirmative action, we're talking about affirmative action with respect to marginalized group members. As Cornell West says, even if you eliminate that, we have affirmative action for certain white individuals already in this society and nation, but that it is invisible because whiteness is a default standard. White Western concepts is a default standard that makes it indeed invisible. The other thing I would say is that in the world that I work with, in terms of microaggressions, I don't find it to be a laughing stock, especially among marginalized group members. They think the language of microaggressions explains a reality to them that validates their reality, and that in some sense they don't feel that it reassures them that they aren't crazy. What I find people laughing at it is that those individuals, when they hear microaggressions, the term microaggressions, know that they have committed it. That's why they get defensive and upset and defend against it and ridicule it in one way or another. And it goes to the heart of the context that I was trying to build for microaggressions. None of us in this room, born and raised in the United States, is immune from inheriting the racial, gender, sexual orientation of our forebears. And you can look at studies that deal with implicit and explicit studies. We know that by age, by age 3, 4, and even earlier, people note differences. By age, 6, they begin to associate negativism with differences. From 6 to 10, both what we call implicit and explicit bias rises. From about 10 to adulthood, explicit bias plummets. That is the type of bias where you say, oh, African Americans are natural-born athletes and musicians. No, we consciously know that's not true. But what happens is that from 10 years of age to adulthood, implicit bias is untouched. And I guess what I'm saying is that many of the people who tend to, derogate, microaggressions are individuals who frankly don't realize the actions, the words, the deeds that they are saying have hidden meanings to them. When you ask someone, how do you feel about interracial relationships? Oh, I think it's okay, but I worry about the children. That's hard to prove, but I'm saying that there is a meta-communication that the language of defense, and when I talk to administrators who over all of these issues, I see resistance. I see personal denials that they are biased because it is awful. I see denial of institutional bias and racism. And I see, and this all comes up in language. When you do a linguistic analysis that's going on, you can almost always find that there is both a conscious communication and a meta or hidden communication that is being, so I haven't run into people who, most people of color knows that it's real to them.
Do you think if the more that people are attuned to pay attention to the meta communication, the more they will suffer and experience it, that it will increase in...
We're talking about targets or perpetrators.
Targets.
I mean, this is defensive. Yeah. We call targets and defensive.
Sorry, the targets will actually experience more aggression,
yes.
The more attuned they feel to attention to that meta level of communication.
It goes to the issue of 30, 40 years ago, when I was at the University of Oregon getting my doctorate, I denied, because it was so painful to realize that there were all these negative things coming from it. And that denial, in some sense, protected me and allowed me to do my work. As I got older and when the Asian American, the yellow power movement occurred, the brown power, the red power and the black power movements occur, I began to feel this sense of validation that this was real and I could no longer hold it down. And for me, despite that it's more painful, my reality is sharpened in terms of understanding what is going on. So I know that that's what's happening. And when people of color reach this critical mass, where let me give you an example. We did observations in classrooms. One of our things was microaggressions by students directed against students of color. We went in and did studies, and this is an aside, but we found that the greatest perpetrators of microaggressions were not fellow students, it was a professor. And we can get into that later. But when a microaggression occurs in the classroom, you can't believe how many students of color immediately make eye contact. The white students seem oblivious to it. Now that eye contact that really happened. You're not crazy. You're not paranoid. And that is the validation that I find the critical mass increasing. And we can talk about social media. People condemn social media, microaggressions, label, but social media has really empowered people of color. It's also been destructive, but empowered people of color to be able to communicate with each other. And there's a microaggression blog that many of you know that was started at Columbia University, thousands of examples of microaggressions. And it kind of validates people that, yes, we're not crazy, because we're always told that we're misperceiving the situation. And more often than not, when I bring this up, I hear comments that, you know, that wasn't my intent. Now that's a ploy in itself, because you have shifted the battleground to intent, and proving intent is very difficult. In law, you know, intent is a basis of whether you get a manslaughter charge or a murder charge. But to me, these are things that people of color are used to, would not be so aware of it. They would feel uncomfortable, but now it is out in the open. It is being articulated, and many white colleagues, friends, neighbors don't like it. That don't like that we're saying, naming it, as Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Press said, that the first movements or deliberation is for people of color to be able to name what oppresses them. It deconstructs the atmosphere. And that's what I see going on, and that's why you're getting the turmoil here. People of color no longer want to just be silent.
I'm going to have to be the bad guy and cut this off. This has been a fascinating and rich discussion, but I would invite everybody to come upstairs for our reception and continue the conversation. Thank you, Professor Erler, and thanks to both of you.
Thank you.